everyone, welcome back to alkaline hydroxide 784. Today we'll be looking at something that has definitely decreased in the past few months, tourism. Instead of following the usual categorization of economic, social, etc., instead we'll be looking at tourism's effects from the point of view of different actors. They would include tourists, locals, those in the tourism industry/aviation industry, the government, the environment/animals, industries/businesses. Yeah, I think there's more than enough point of views. So let's start, shall we? So let's start with the people who are experiencing the actual tourism. Why do we go on trips? As an avid tourist myself, I can say why. For those who go on on tour packages, it's convenient and everything is pre-prepared. So like it's nice for them to just pick up one tour package and just go. They don't need to do much. But I'm not that kind of person. I'm like the kind who likes to plan everything. So for people like that, it's the satisfaction and the fun of doing just that. Like it's fun to plan. It's fun to, experience some challenges while planning, and I like it. So that's the first point. The second point is you get to escape routine life for a bunch of days. So, like, the reason why I feel like I haven't had a real vacation this year is precisely because I have neither had the time nor the opportunity to go on a trip. And I'm not even talking about whether it's going overseas or not. I haven't even gone on a trip within Singapore. You know what I mean? Like, this summer vacation, I was just doing something else, and then now I'm still doing stuff. I haven't had like a real vacation. I guess that's pretty relatable. Anyways, so somehow I am still sane despite this. Anyway, so the third point is I can finally read some books when I go on a trip. Like if I'm at home, I sometimes have the time to read books if I'm having a real vacation for that matter. But if I don't have enough time, then I just don't read anything. But if I go overseas, there's nothing else much to really do, and even if you get Wi-Fi, you don't want to use too much of it, so I can read some books for once. So it's kind of like the previous point. I get to escape a routine life, and I get to do things that I otherwise wouldn't do in my everyday life. So the next point is that you learn new things. So you learn about the place that you're going to, because if the best way to learn is by actually experiencing it and seeing it in real life. And you also get to learn about other cultures. Of course, this is debatable, depends on how much you actually experience it, but you can learn about other cultures. You can learn about yourself and wherever you're traveling, be it your family or your friends. And actually, that's pretty important too, because sometimes, like when you go from what you normally do and you get into a new situation, which is going on a trip, you get to find out new things about yourself. How do you behave in this certain situation? How does your family member behave or your friend behave in this certain situation? So you get to learn about a lot of new things. Of course, whether those new things are good or bad is dependent on your actual trip, but you get the point. So next point is you get to do new things. So this is different from the previous point. The previous point was you get to learn new things, but here you get to do new things. For example, you get to eat new food, you get to try new activities, you get to experience the unexpected. And it's not just about things that are not available in your own country, but it's also about things that are available in your country, but you usually wouldn't go for that thing. But since you're overseas and you have the time, you can now go to that place. For example, maybe you go for escape room, or if you go for like certain adventurous activities like rafting or I don't know, bungee jumping or parasailing or something like that. And I think it's possible to do some of these things here in Singapore, but people don't have time to do it, so they do it when they're overseas. And the new place kind of helps you want to do such things. So the last point is that it's fun. Like it makes me happy. It makes some people happy when they go on a trip. And in general, that's why it's considered more worthwhile to spend on experiences than on actual material goods. And that's why I don't really get it when people buy me some gifts, because I don't use most of the things. But I would really like it if they I mean, I usually like maybe a gift card because I can buy the thing that I actually want. Or if you're going somewhere and doing something that's a lot more meaningful than an actual gift, like a physical gift. So yeah, like it's more worthwhile than material goods unless those goods are Muji pens because we all like them. Yeah. Okay. So that's good and all, but there are still certain things that are somewhat not so great about tourism for the tourist itself. So first point, like of why it may not be as good as you expect it to be is tour packages. So if you're taking a tour package, usually they tend to be limited. So they limit you to only the popular places and you don't really have a lot of flexibility. You have to follow their schedule and they also tend to be like cash grabbers because they bring tourists to like jewelry shops and stuff like that. I guess it depends on the tour operator, but still, there are quite a few tour packages in which tourists are brought to places just to spend money, and some people don't appreciate that. I mean, who has time to go and buy some jewelry? Honestly. Okay. But yeah, on a similar note, if you're not taking a tour package and you're planning the trip yourself, unless you're a really careful planner, you may not plan it very well. So if you make a very superficial plan, you just like, okay, these are the top 10 locations, just go to those top 10 locations. Or like only 5 of those locations because you don't have time. Then your trip is a bit superficial. I mean, you may have fun, but it is not really the best trip or it could be improved in the sense there is potential for improvement. And it's a very superficial plan. You don't see the true nature of the city. You don't see like you don't experience it in its in its fullness for that matter. And yes, I mean it is a bit weird for me to say this because I also plan my trips and you might be wondering whether I'm like any better than those other people. And yes, I may not be that much better than them, but I still try to visit other not so not the most popular places, but try to visit at least one unusual location. And I think that makes it more fun. So yeah, that's the next point. So the next point is that some people want to go on trips to escape routine life, but among some of those people, there are some who cannot escape work even on vacation because nowadays like working isn't just about working in a office from 8 to 5, and that's how we are still managing to have people working during the pandemic. They can work from home, they can work from literally anywhere, and anywhere includes overseas as well. So what that means is that some people cannot escape their work, and because they have their smartphone and they are forced to like use Wi-Fi and respond to work messages and work calls. And that is troublesome to say the least because it kind of defeats the purpose of going somewhere to escape routine life. And you are not exactly experiencing the place, you're just looking at your phone and thinking about work and the entire time, then your trip is not really much of a trip anymore. And what's the solution to that? Well, there are quite a few places where they offer this thing where you disconnect for 24 hours or something like that. So I mean they're not really trips per se, but they're more of like just a day or two where you don't use your phone, you just disconnect and enjoy the place, like in resorts maybe. And that could probably help with maybe just giving you that chance to escape routine life for once. But at the same time, I'm not sure how many people would be willing to do that because the phone is also perfect for doing a lot of other fun things, and not being with your phone can be a bit daunting for some people. So yeah, that's one of the points. And I've also heard of workcations coming up because of the pandemic. So the hotels need to attract people to come and use them. So they offer packages for workcations, but in the end, that also kind of defeats the purpose because you cannot focus on either work nor being in a vacation. Yeah, so I guess it's just a thing. So the next point is that some people face anxiety traveling, and there's also many mishaps that can happen when you're traveling. Of course, the biggest anxiety is usually in flying, even though flying is considered one of the safest transportation methods in the world, because the airline industry gets so much scrutiny over the safety practices, and therefore they end up being quite one of the most, like, the safest forms of transportation. So that's all the anxiety some people have, which can kind of ruin their enthusiasm for the trip. Another thing that can happen is mishaps during the actual trip, which can be like maybe someone stole your money or someone stole your jewelry, or it could be something like you get sick overseas from food poisoning. Yes, it has happened to me as well. I got food poisoning once. And other things can happen, and you don't really want that kind of stuff to happen to you when you're on a trip. You're supposed to have fun and then go back and just continue your life as normal, right? But sometimes bad things happen, and that's the bad part of the unexpected. If it's good unexpected stuff, then it's okay, but if it's bad stuff, then the purpose of going on a trip feels a bit defeated. But we all learn from bad things as well, so it's not an issue. We get to learn from the experience either way. I guess one solution to that is to focus on the positive parts of the trip, because even if, let's say, I get food poisoning or something, it's not like the rest of the trip was invalid just because of that one part of the trip. And also just to take note of what you should or shouldn't do next time in order to prevent that from happening. So that is one of the points. And the next point is, some people do illegal things overseas. And I'm not talking about the normal just being a nuisance kind of thing, but actual illegal things. So this is probably more common with Western tourists, because they want to, do their sins overseas so that they can feel a bit less, embarrassed about it. And I'm not even going to list them out or anything, because I think you know what I'm referring to. And because of that, they can either get arrested, or if they aren't arrested, it's not very nice to do that. Like, just because you don't do it at home doesn't mean you should be doing it somewhere else. Like, the local people also not be very happy about that. So yeah, that's one other thing that can be quite bad. Another thing is that some people who actually like routines, like, there are definitely people who cannot not do a routine. I mean, for me, I do like following a routine in general, though I'm fine with not having a routine during the actual trip. But there are some people who are really, really into routines, like, they cannot not have a routine. And for those people, or maybe not necessarily a routine per se, but there'll be certain things that they confirm must do even when they go on vacation. I'm not even talking about work. It could be something like maybe going to a gym, or maybe like waking up at a certain time, or doing certain things at certain times, or even taking medication at certain times. And it can be a problem for these people. Although I think in general there are quite a few hotels that help cater to these people as well. For example, the people who like to go to a gym, because hotels have gyms in them. And there are also hotels that maybe cater to certain other needs that people might have. And the last point, oh my, this is truly relatable. Food can be an issue, trust me. So this is actually kind of related to the previous point, because this is something that cannot be compromised for some people, especially for people who have dietary restrictions. Like for me, for example, I'm a vegetarian, and my parents are, not very keen on trying that many other kinds of cuisines. I mean, like, we end up just eating at Indian restaurants even overseas. So yeah, it's troublesome. I mean, like, it's not like we don't want to try new food, but we'd rather just eat Indian food. Because we are definitely more sure that whatever that we're eating is vegetarian, and also it's just more comfortable that way. Oh well. But it doesn't mean that we aren't ready to try new things. It's just that we generally don't want to do it for a meal. However, there are actually people who go overseas just to eat new food. So yeah, I guess it's just one of those things that can be a deal breaker in a sense when you're going overseas. Yeah, so that's kind of cool. I guess we got all the points that you can say from the point of view of a tourist, and you can come up with points if you're an avid tourist or someone who travels a lot. So let's move on. Let's look at something else. So tourists be enjoying their time overseas. What about the locals? Do they like tourists or not? Well, we do see many a site saying tourists are easy to spot, like they're like really obvious, and tend to be kind of a nuisance in certain ways. There are complaints about noisy, littering tourists, and did I mention people doing illegal stuff? Yep. So locals certainly aren't that warmed up to tourists who perform les faux pas. But it's not really just in that sense. Some tourism displaces local businesses or even homes. It can make locals feel like their homeland is no longer what it once was. Yeah, so it happens for indigenous groups, but it can also happen for, you know, city people. So in terms of indigenous groups, well, it happens when either people just come and visit them like they're going to a zoo or something. So it kind of affects them in a way because they're just going about their everyday lives and then suddenly a bunch of tourists comes and stares at them. And that's kind of awkward. It's like invading their privacy. Or it could be another way in the sense that their homeland is displaced for a tourism purpose. And that can be even more detrimental because they can't stay on that land anymore and they have to find some other place to go. And that land is, just decreasing in size day by day because there's more and more land being used for other purposes. So apart from indigenous groups, there's also cases of it happening in the city. Because, imagine you're just walking around, you might see some like places where there's more tourists than locals. And that is not cool. It doesn't feel legit anymore. It doesn't feel like a real home kind of vibe. It just feels like there's a lot of tourists in that place. And there are literally places just built for tourism and not really for the locals per se. And like for example, if you think about it, if we go to like all of our so-called heritage locations, or even if you go to the different parts lah, like the old Istana basically. Is it the old Istana, which is now the Malay Heritage Center? I think that whole place is a bit like touristy. It doesn't feel very authentic from the point of view of some people. And yeah, it just feels like a place for tourists to come and just see, wow, this place looks nice, and just go back. Yeah. And likewise, even though like Chinatown and Little India also have like certain places which are more for tourists to come and visit compared to for like real authentic locals to come and do their everyday things. Although there are also parts of Chinatown and Little India that are more authentic and aren't as visited by tourists. So you can see it even here in Singapore, even though Singapore is actively trying to attract tourism because we don't have a lot of natural resources. Right. So another problem that can happen is that big businesses can outcompete smaller local businesses as they generally have more resources to cater to tourists and the like, which means that sometimes, local businesses can feel a bit salty about tourism, and even the locals can feel a bit salty about it. So how do we solve this? Well, there are definitely a few programs to help integrate local communities. There's some places where they do village stays where you can interact with the locals. It's like staying in someone else's house, like a family stay kind of thing. And in general will be like, they'll give the money back to the locals, the villagers. And there are also other solutions like dispersing tourists to prevent overcrowding because the phenomenon of seeing more tourists than locals is literally that. So if you disperse the tourists a bit, maybe you'll see lesser tourists, which is something that's been mentioned in a Guardian article. So if you want to see other solutions that are mentioned in it, you can just go and read it yourself. There's a bunch of stuff that they mentioned there to help solve this issue. Yeah, so right now you might be asking, but tourism gives money to the country. Isn't that a good thing? And yes, you're right. That would be the main benefit to the tourism industry, which is not what I was talking about just now. I was talking about more of the local people who, like, especially those who do not work in the tourism industry. So yeah, so the idea of money is more of a benefit to the tourism industry and in consequence to the government. So let's talk about the tourism industry. How does it benefit? Well, they make big buck on tourism. We already just mentioned that. From the aviation industry all the way to attractions, tourism is a big business. So apart from earning a lot of money, they also give jobs to a lot of people. So the people who are employed in the tourism industry definitely benefit from it. So let's say if the country doesn't have a lot of jobs, having a tourism industry there in place gives a lot of jobs to people who otherwise wouldn't have jobs. And it also helps to prop up a country. So this is in the case where a country doesn't have natural resources and they have human resources, then those human resources can be used as for tourism and hospitality jobs, and that will help to give the country some money and also give jobs to these people. And it also helps to get recognition of the country, like maybe if the country has a certain issue by promoting tourism and doing things like that, it will basically get recognition from other countries. And also the tourism industry benefits from getting help from the government of the local country itself. So they get benefits in those ways. So yeah, that's great. But as we have seen this year, the tourism industry is also a very vulnerable industry. Things have become so bad now because, flight nowhere are a thing. We'll talk about them later. And staycations have been promoted in hopes of garnering some business from not tourists, but locals. What does this mean and how can we help prevent this? Well, it's hard. Well, we all know that. Globalization is kind of the force that feeds and invigorates the industry. But as we hopefully all know, globalization has caused quite a bit of dependency between countries, and the pandemic has certainly highlighted that big time. And tourism is one of those places where countries are dependent on others. Hence, as someone who's not exactly an expert on how to solve globalization issues, I don't really have a great solution for this issue because it's quite intrinsic. It's a bit hard to overcome the issue unless you have ways to get money locally. So I guess it's up to the governments to figure out how to be less dependent on tourism and find other ways to make money. Speaking of the government, we'll be covering them at the end because I feel that's the best. So first, let's look at the environment next. As I've heard in my French classes before, yes, it's funny how French can help with GP. Go figure. Tourism actually has a lot of negative effects on the environment. Hotels, attractions, aviation, they all take a lot of electricity and emit a lot of greenhouse gases. They also require space, and sometimes that space is taken from cleared land, aka cutting down trees. Or sometimes if a natural environment is a tourist spot, tourism may mess up the place through littering and the sorts. Through this, animals who live in such places could be displaced or fed unhealthy stuff by tourists. And that's why the flights to nowhere have been criticized by some for emitting a lot while not actually accomplishing any practical function. Of course, there are still reasons why they're still being done because apparently the airplanes need to be flown once in a while. Otherwise, it's for maintenance purposes. And the aviation industry is in dire need of money, as you've just mentioned. And people still buy the tickets, so it seems like people are still willing to go on these flights to nowhere. And also, I think another point is that the aviation industry is also trying to move to more eco-friendly fuels, like the kind that's from biofuel, and they're trying their best to hopefully reduce emissions because newer machines can also help to reduce the amount of emissions from the fuels itself, and newer fuels also help to reduce the amount of emissions. And yeah, if we manage to go to solar energy and other forms of electricity, maybe that will make hotels and attractions less, carbon guzzling in a sense. So of course, it's not all gloom and doom. Apart, if in that sense, and this isn't even about the fuel or solar energy or anything. It's possible to do tourism correctly in a way that can be used to fund environmental efforts or just to prevent further degradation of the land. So for example, if a natural location is used, you can take measures to remind tourists not to litter and also minimize the effects on local flora and fauna. That can go a long way. So, for example, when I went to New Zealand, they have a lot of walking trails. I mean, yeah, trails. And the thing is, it's really like scrutiny. Like there's a lot of processes that you have to go through. So in the airport, you have to make sure you're not bringing in any bugs or insects that are foreign to New Zealand. And like when you're going on walking trails, your shoes will get cleaned. Like not really physically clean, but like there's a thing at the bottom to help rub off any excess dirt or something. And the trails are very nicely built, like they're just nice and clean, and you're not supposed to go out of the trail, of course. So since everything is very nicely demarcated, it kind of encourages tourists to stay within the trail and like not go and get themselves injured or do something stupid in the rest of the park or the forest. And there are also a lot of like little boards and stuff to tell them what's there. And everything is like very left alone. That you don't need a lot of staff to maintain the area. It's actually really nice and clean there, which means people are, taking the initiative to not litter as much and make sure that the place is clean. And I think we can all appreciate that and try to follow that in other places as well. So apart from measures like this, there are also other ways that you can do things, which is to have ecotourism or green tourism programs, which there are quite a few tour companies doing right now. And yeah, it sounds like a good thing, but it remains to be seen whether these programs truly help the environment, because I've heard that they may not be that great after all. The point of them is to, maybe like the person going to like visiting the country helps to plant some trees or do some kind of eco work, or maybe like the program itself is designed in a way to minimize emissions and things like that. So that's really up to the program itself, how it actually works and whether it actually works to begin with. And it remains to be seen what the overall effect of these tour packages will be. Right, so back to the government. The reason why I put the government at the end is because all of the other factors that we have seen just now influence the government in a way, like they're kind of interlinked. The government has to balance everything. In fact, they have to balance, attracting tourists and managing the tourists, dealing with the locals, dealing with the businesses, dealing with the environment, and possibly more. In a way, tourism is generally beneficial for governments, especially when it gives them the much needed GDP. And in fact, there are some countries which literally depend on tourism to survive, as we have mentioned from globalization. But tourism can also be a big challenge to manage and deal with because, as I said, because they are dependent on tourism so much. When there's a crisis, it becomes a problem. They have to give funds to the businesses that need them. For example, the aviation industry is struggling right now because, yeah, they need the funds to stay afloat. And yeah, another thing that I'm actually reminded of here is the reputation of the country. So apart from having to manage everything, the government also has to worry about the country's reputation. This reputation can be sculpted through both what is offered, which is the tourist attractions and the hospitality services, and what is sent, basically the tourists themselves, which some people hate. So governments kind of have to deal with rude tourists who could ruin their reputation. Or China, anyone? Yeah. They had to have like bans for people who are rude, and it's kind of funny actually. And at the same time, they have to give tourists like a social media view of the country, i.e., a more idealistic view than what it actually is, which is kind of what happens when you go on a superficial trip. You just go to the popular places and you don't notice what the actual country looks like. So yeah, it's like that's their job in the end. And how they benefit or how they are disadvantaged is dependent on what reputation they get in the end, and also dependent on other factors that aren't necessarily tourism per se, but other social factors in the country. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think for the government, it will be either they might get negative feedback from the locals, or they may get negative feedback from other countries depending on how they manage the tourism and how certain things are done. So yeah, in conclusion, I think there is quite a lot to be learned about the tourism industry. And if you've ever traveled before, it'd be good to know a bit more about what goes on behind the scenes as well, or at least what going on in general, like the whole system. Because even when traveling, it's good to be a responsible tourist and make sure not to visit places that are too tourist traps, or like places that encourage animal abuse or things like that. So it's good to research and make sure you know what you're doing before you go to a place and just get stuck there and just do very superficial things that may not be very good for anyone. And at the same time, you don't have to feel so bad about traveling to a place just because it's very emissions heavy and everything. I know that flying is actually quite emissions heavy, but at the same time, we all really like to travel. It's something that's quite hard to avoid. So I guess it's something we have to take into account when we travel next time. Maybe travel to nearer places, or maybe if you're traveling somewhere very far, then stay there for a longer period of time, so you don't have to keep making short trips to the place, and instead make one long trip and stay there for experience as much as you can and then come back, so that you don't have to keep going there many times just to see the places there. So there are ways that we can mitigate our own impact in terms of the tourism industry. And apart from environmental impact, we can also be considerate of who we are talking to or who we are meeting there when we go on a trip. Maybe take some effort to learn a bit of the local language, or even if we don't need to because they can speak English, or just be mindful and respectful and don't just randomly be rude to people for no reason. And I guess trying the local cuisine is dependent on you. If you really cannot do it, then it's okay. It's not obligatory for you to go and try the local cuisine when you're there, but you can do something else that is local at the very least. Maybe experience something that other tourists don't do, or go to somewhere unusual. That may help a bit with the overcrowding problem as well, because if there's more people who are going to other lesser visited places, then it'll be a bit more evened out and it won't look like the tourists are flooding that one place in the country. So yeah, that's about it. I hope you found this episode useful. I know this is a bit weird because during the pandemic there's absolutely not a lot of tourism going on anymore, so but before the pandemic, this is what we were considering in terms of the impacts of tourism. And yeah, I guess hopefully in the future things will go back to normal, or at least some semblance of normalcy. And yeah, good luck for your exams, I guess. Yeah, I know I'm just being really random right now. Okay, so if you found this video useful, please press the like button and subscribe. And with that, I would like to say thank you and bye.